So we have a brand new developer interview with the developers of Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. This coming to us directly from Square Enix from their Insider Square Enix series, where the host Hiroki Yasumoto sat down with 4 members of the dev team to talk about their process of making Remake and Rebirth. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, subscribe, leave a comment, click that bell icon if you want to stay up to date with my videos. I know people probably get tired of hearing this, but as YouTubers, we kind of have to say that because it actually does help a bit, and doing any one of those things really does help out the channel a ton. So in this video, they sat down with Naoki Hamaguchi, who is the game's director, Motomo Toriyama, who is the co-director, Shintaro Takai, who is the art director, and Teruki Endo, who is the battle director. Now, I won't be covering every aspect of this video because I would highly encourage you to check it out for yourself. And we've done a ton of developer interviews here on the channel in the past year plus, and they were all in the written form. So this is really the first time we're getting to see these guys sit down and just kind of chat and laugh and, mess around with each other. And you really see the bonds that these guys have built, the camaraderie. It's something that's super special. So I'd encourage you to check out the video, and I'll leave a link in the description below so you can watch it for yourself. But we're just going to go over some of the few things that kind of stood out to me. Starting off first with Shintaro Takai, he reminisces about the first time that they moved away from 2D to 3D and how they were told, all right, you just finished Final Fantasy VI, now the next one, it's not going to be 2D, it's going to be 3D. And he talks about how that was a really big struggle to make 7 because at the time in Japan, they had no 3D tools available for them to use. They had to get everything overseas here in the US, and all of the manuals were in English, so they're basically working on the fly trying to translate these manuals while also learning how to use the tools and create these games. So he kind of describes that entire process of them fumbling through FF7. And the fact that that game came out as good as it did is pretty incredible. He also mentions 2 scenes in particular that at first he was not fond of, but after seeing them, he's like, okay, I'll shut up, this actually works. And oddly enough, they're 2 dance scenes. The first one being Red 13 dancing on the Shinra 8 in Rebirth, and then the dance scene with Cloud at the Honeybee Inn in 7 Remake. He was concerned that maybe that wouldn't fit the character of Cloud and that maybe it was too jokey, but once he saw both of those scenes, he's like, okay, these actually do work. And then there's a funny moment where he points out one specific section in the Nibelheim flashback with how every character gets off of the truck to fight the monster, and Cloud and the soldiers just kind of jump off and run into battle. And he points out that if you look at Sephiroth, he gets off of the truck in a very true to Sephiroth way. He takes a shortcut and just kind of glides off of the truck, which really does kind of stay true to the character, and it just shows you how much detail they put into what these characters do, how they talk, how they move. And he was really proud of that. And Takai in general just seems like a genuinely funny guy. He cracks a lot of jokes in the interview, and he seems like a really cool person to just kind of be around. So up next, Toriyama talks about changing the original Nibelheim scene, how it was in the original game, to how they changed it to Rebirth. So in the OG, when you first enter Nibelheim, it feels like a ghost town. Everyone's hiding in their houses. No one wants to come out and introduce themselves to Sephiroth and the crew. And he felt that with today's realistic graphics, doing that would have been a little too jarring. So they flipped the scenario and changed it to a town that was now welcoming Sephiroth and these heroes because they are their heroes. They're coming to save the day, essentially. And I really love that change because it's this really ironic, bittersweet thing where this town loves Sephiroth so much. They idolize him, they want his photo, they want his autograph. Wherever he goes in the town, the people follow. And at the end of the day, that guy that they love so much would be the death of their town and its people because he would destroy it. So the irony there is very poetic and very bittersweet. Up next, Hamaguchi talks about how the grasslands was kind of their testing area for the other aspects of the open world areas they would craft later on. And they would end up redesigning the grasslands around 3 to 4 times because they just weren't really happy with what they had with each rough draft. And Takai even points out that if you look at the concept art, the grasslands at first were really kind of bland, and it was just these endless hills with no variations or interesting points. And with that being the first area that the player really, sees for the first time in Rebirth, this vast open world, it had to make a good impression. So they redesigned it about 3 to 4 times, really taking care to make the hills look a certain way, to have the viewpoint of the ocean stick out to the player. And he even goes as far as to say you couldn't just have hills and oceans, they had to be Final Fantasy VII hills and oceans. They had to feel like they belong to this world. And I think they did a really great job, because when you see the grasslands for the first time, it's this really big special moment that still kind of sticks with me, because you notice all of those little details that they put in. And funny enough, Hamaguchi and the dev team said that by the time they finished the grasslands, it ended up being a lot bigger than they had originally envisioned. So the grasslands is about 3 areas big. It's the grasslands itself, there's like the wastelands, and then the marshlands. So it is a pretty massive area in the game, and I think it might actually be the biggest in Rebirth. Next, Hamaguchi talks about the trial and error of designing the different maps, and how, again, they have to create all of these different rough drafts to kind of figure things out. I would assume like physics and character models, how you're going to interact with people in the town, the NPCs, and they have to do multiple builds and multiple teardowns for each area, which is super tedious. And he describes it as a trial and error process, but he's actually glad that they did it, because you can just work a little bit slower and design certain aspects, because the last thing you want to do is completely design an area, get your assets in there, and then you realize, oh crap, we have to tear all of this down and start over again. So it's a trial and error process, but I think it kind of influenced how they were able to create the rest of the areas for that game. And there's a really funny moment where Toriyama talks about the placement of benches, and specifically the vending machines, and how he might change that for Remake Part 3, because they're just sitting right outside a lot of shops. So he's like, there's no incentive for people in this world to go into the shop and buy stuff, because you can just go to the vending machine and get it for a cheaper price, which I thought was pretty funny. So if in Remake Part 3 you see vending machines inside of stores, know that Toriyama made that change. Up next, they talk about one of the favorite aspects for me in Remake and Rebirth, and that is the game's combat. And this is where Teruki Endo comes in. Now, Teruki Endo joined the dev team for Remake about halfway through the development process, and he had just come off of working on Monster Hunter World as that lead combat designer for that game. So he was coming off of Capcom, and he also worked on games like RE5 and Monster Hunter 4. And Capcom has a huge respected pedigree when it comes to action games, fighting games. So these people that work on Capcom games, they really do know what they're doing. And he talked about trying to find the right balance when crafting the combat system for Remake, because he didn't want to push the action element so far that the command-based menu got lost. He still wanted it to stay true to the original game. And after leaving Capcom, he really wanted to make a battle system that would challenge himself and push him to do something brand new. Now, interestingly enough, he says he regrets making the scope of combat in Remake too narrow. Rebirth was an opportunity for him to really expand the breadth of combat and what characters could do. And you don't really notice how narrow combat is in Remake until you've played Rebirth. In playing Rebirth, you look back at Remake and it's like, oh yeah, this feels way more like a beta of what they wanted to do. But with time constraints and money constraints, he couldn't really expand upon that stuff past what they had in Remake. And after playing through Rebirth, it is kind of hard to go back and play through Remake, because I got so used to perfect parries, the improvement for character movements and dodging, the synergy skills and abilities. So to see how much they changed combat from Remake to Rebirth has me excited for Rebirth to Part 3, because there's so much that they can do. Hamaguchi also adds that before Endo joined, they were so experienced with doing combat menu-based stuff, and that was easy, that came simple to them, but they couldn't figure out the action part. And Hamaguchi literally says that the game didn't feel good to play until Endo came on board. And what's nuts is once Endo joined, within 6 months, he had the combat for Remake down. He came up with the entire idea of what the combat and action stuff would be in that short period of time, and then they would spend about a year or so just polishing things. So he had to come in, work with what he had, but also tear a lot down and kind of start from scratch in certain areas. And Hamaguchi mentions that at that time, they had every boss planned out and how the player would defeat said boss. So Endo had to work around all of those restrictions as well. But for him to come in and just on the fly come up with all of that stuff and kind of ingratiate himself to the team and challenge himself is incredible. And it really goes to show you how important every person on a development team actually is, because if Endo never came on board, we might not have a Rebirth. We might be looking at a 7 remake that had potential but wasn't fun to play because they just couldn't nail the combat aspects. Another thing that Endo took really good care of was making sure that a character's personality matched their attacks and movements in battle. So Cloud being like that all-around combat guy, very stoic, very strong, his combat animation should match that personality. And again, they really nailed that with the characters. Aerith is this really fun, kind of spunky, graceful character, and you see that in her combat. Tifa is this tough, but also kind of sensitive monk fighter. You see that in her attacks, and it's the same with Barret and Red 13. So again, these developers take a lot of care into making sure that characters are consistent through and through, whether it's story, dialogue, or gameplay. And they absolutely nailed that. Now, speaking of more combat stuff, they touch on the synergy attacks and how some of them are a little goofy. And they even came up with a ratio internally of like, okay, we can have a specific number of synergy attacks that are comical, and then we can have a specific amount that are really stylish and flashy and cool. And I think Toriyama even joked that the ratio was somewhere along the line of 7-3. Because if you look at the synergy attacks in that game, they're so cool. And some of my favorite ones are the silly, goofy ones. And they point out specifically the one with Barret and Aerith, where they both pull out sunglasses, put them on, and then unleash their attack, which is really cute. And it, again, fits with those characters. Barret is serious, but he can also be fun and silly. Aerith naturally is a goofy kind of character, so for her to pull out the sunglasses and be kind of cool, it just fits with her so well. They even touch upon the Midgar Zormer and how they designed a specific section of that battle where this gigantic snake just soaks up all of the heat in the area. And I think Barret even has a comment like, did it just suddenly get really chilly around here? And then it unleashes this fire attack on you. So Sakai had to take really great care into making sure that they could introduce elements into the area that could be burnable. Trees, branches, some of the rock faces, it all had to work with the enemy and what its attacks were. So again, they put a lot of great care into all of this stuff. And I really can't wait to see what combat again is going to be like in Remake Part 3, and I hope we can move from doing synergy attacks with 2 characters to synergy attacks that involve the entire party, not just the 3 characters. I'm talking everyone, and I think they're going to build to that. And we got a sneak preview of that in that Jenova battle where everyone's getting a piece of Jenova, getting in on the action, which lands this big ultimate attack with the 3 main party members. And I'm also really curious to see what story inspirations they take to improve upon the combat and change things and add the new combat stuff. Because again, they don't change things just to change things in these games. They like to have story motivation behind a lot of them. And then of course there's the introduction of the new characters like Vincent and Sid, and how are they going to fit into the landscape of this party and their synergy abilities and special attacks. So there's a lot that they're going to have to try and figure out and make work, and this is going to be the last game. But in regards to this combat system, it's so well received, it's so much fun to play, I never get tired of it. And I know a lot of people have said that they hope this combat system returns in other Square Enix games, but I don't know if it will. As much as I would like to see it implemented in like a Final Fantasy VI remake or a Final Fantasy VIII remake, or even a story-driven big budget version of Dissidia where you get all the heroes and villains together in a 60-hour RPG that uses these mechanics, which would be sick. The identity of this combat system is so closely tied to Final Fantasy VII Remake as a project, so it might be kind of weird to have that combat system in another Square Enix game. And I don't know if the teams at Square Enix would want to even do that. Like Teruki Endo said, I think, a lot of people want to challenge themselves and come up with something different and new that hasn't been done before. And I'm also very curious to see if Endo sticks with the company after, doing Remake Part 3. Could they potentially have him lead another Final Fantasy game, which could be super cool. And then to end things, they ask their developers for some quick notes on what people can expect for Remake Part 3, starting with Endo. And he says he wants players to have more freedom when it comes to the gameplay and the combat. And again, I think introducing Vincent and Sid, doing tri-tech attacks or synergy attacks and synergy limit breaks maybe even that get everyone involved, I think is going to be one of the ways they go about that. Sakai was pretty self-reflective, and he said that there isn't really anyone on the team that felt 100% confident with what they did in Rebirth. He still feels like there's room for improvements on multiple aspects of that game, and that's what he wants to work towards personally on Remake Part 3, is the improvements being better. Toriyama talks about getting to work on sections that he gets to create, because so much of Remake and Rebirth, they were, really working down to the wire, and he was working on other people's creations. So he's really hoping to get the ability to craft his own stuff from the ground up. And then we end with Hamaguchi, who says he hopes that people can see how Rebirth can really evolve the Final Fantasy franchise going forward, and really focusing on giving players a new type of gameplay experience for Remake Part 3. I think that includes traversal, the introduction of the Highwind airship, adding more chocobos like the gold chocobo, and then of course building out and expanding that world for new areas, which I think is going to be really cool to see how they do all of that. And he does remind people that they're trying to finish Remake Part 3 as soon as possible because they don't want the wait to be super long. So with that being said, that is the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought of this developer interview. And was there anything that you learned from this interview that kind of stood out to you or maybe surprised you that you didn't know of beforehand? For me, it had to be Teruki Endo coming in halfway through development and crafting this incredible combat system within 6 months. So let me know in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.